That was very good. Put the context very well. Being an academic, of course, one likes to complicate matters, right? Otherwise, one would never be here. So, she's very right to say the RSS is what she said it is. But the RSS at one point, after the murder, assassination of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, banned in India. First time. Then how did it come to a point where today it stands and dictates the path of this diverse and multifaceted country? To go back to that, you have to go back to the person that Narendra Modi idolizes the most in this country, outside of people from the Hindu Mahasabha pantheon. In terms of political leader, the person that he idolizes is Mrs. Indira Gandhi. He believes that she was the one person who had the courage to take India in the direction that India should have gone. And so when Mrs. Gandhi imposed an emergency in the mid-70s, a coalition of political parties and social actors was formed, pushed back and bring India back into the mainstream of political democracy. In that coalition that was formed, which is a purely anti-Congress coalition, for the first time, RSS came overground and played an important role in organizing anti-emergency protests. So one of the things that happens after Mrs. Gandhi calls the election, which she then loses, and which comes to the first coalition government of India, was the legitimization of the RSS, and the RSS then stops being a banned organization. So the choices we make, the paths we take, you never know where they'll get you. And today, if anybody argues that you should proscribe the RSS, that person will be said, you're fit to go into the loony bin. That is the hold of the RSS, that it has been able to bring back the upper caste, which India's independence movement for a while pushed back. So, with these few words, I will go into something which is far drier. It's only economists who believe that what happens in economics has an immediate effect in politics. Of course, there is no such thing. What happens in economics may or may not have immediate political consequences. But eventually, if an economy does not do well, and if an economy enters a crisis, there are political costs to play. Of course, whether the political consequences go in directions that are progressive or not is another call altogether. Do remember the fact that the rise of Hitler was a result of very high rates of unemployment in interwar Germany. So the fact that times are bad does not necessarily mean that you get outcomes that you so desire. But be that as it may, the economy today is going through an unprecedented crisis. According to the Government of India's estimates, which were released in end of November of 2019, second quarter growth rates in the fiscal year 2019-20 have slipped to 4.5%. This is the lowest level recorded in 6.5 years. And the nominal, this is the real rate of growth, which is rate of growth stripped of inflation. If I add inflation in, I get a growth rate of 6%, which is the lowest in more than a decade. Now, this slowing down has begun from the first quarter of January of 2018. So it is 6 successive quarters of a slowdown. At the beginning of that quarter, the economy is growing at about 8%. At the end of the last quarter for which the government is giving you data, it's growing at less than 5%. So this is a remarkable and unprecedented slowdown. One of the drivers of productivity growth in the economy, which is fixed investment, is growing at only 1%. Private consumption, which was keeping the economy afloat when it was growing at 8% in January 2018, has slowed down to less than half that. Manufacturing activity actually contracted in the quarter for which the government's latest data is available. The Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India now expect that 1920 will average only 5%. At the beginning of 1920, the Reserve Bank of India, which is India's central bank, had predicted that the economy will grow at 7.4%. The State Bank of India, which is India's largest bank, the State Bank of India believes, it says, we now believe that the RBI projection of a 6% GDP growth rate for fiscal 21 could be on the higher side. We could be, the State Bank says, staring at sub 6% growth for 2 successive years. So, the story is not only the fact that we are at the midst of an unprecedented slowdown, getting out of that slowdown is not going to be easy and simple, and that we are probably looking at growing at around 6% for 2 or 3 years. And why this matters enormously is the fact that when India was growing at about 9% from the period 2003 to 2008, it achieved a 2% growth of employment. Now, if India is going to almost halve that, you can take it for granted that employment growth will grow also at 1%. The slowdown is widespread from capital goods to infrastructure to consumer goods to automobiles. Almost all segments of commerce and industry face declining sales and massive layoff. The slowdown in automobiles, which again is unprecedented because you've had cutbacks in production month on month for almost 6 months, has led to almost a layoff of 100,000 in the automobile industry itself and hundreds of thousands in ancillary industries. The slowdown in automobile is particularly important because the automobile sector accounts for almost 40% of manufacturing value added. According to market researcher Nielsen, the slowdown in what they call fast-moving consumer goods, all right? The slowdown in fast-moving consumer goods is led by rural demand. Unemployment is at an all-time high, with 100,000 workers left in automobile industry alone. Little wonder then that our SBI, the State Bank of India, reports that both urban and rural wage growth has decelerated from double-digit figures to single-digit figures in nominal terms. That's without accounting for inflation. The slowdown that we're currently going, when the economy is growing at about 5%, is now seeing food inflation at about 7%. right? And overall inflation at about 5%. So you could actually be looking at a situation which used to be the case in the 1970s and the early 80s in developed countries, what they call stagflation, where there is very tepid growth alongside inflation. Right? So when you've got nominal wage growth in rural areas going into single-digit figures without accounting for inflation is growing at 5 or 6%, then you're looking at almost practically zero real wage growth. According to the same RBI report, remittances from migrant workers have slowed down, particularly in states, the labor-sending states of Assam, Bihar, Rajasthan, Orissa, and UP. So, as you can see, it is a multifaceted slowdown which affects just about every single aspect of the economy: investment, consumption, exports, imports. There's nothing left which can revive it. So Arvind Subramaniam and a colleague who faced Josh Feldman have called this is no ordinary slowdown. It is India's great slowdown, where the economy seems to be headed towards the intensive care unit. Now, I've been giving you this. What is the relationship of this with the Modi government? The Modi government actually inherited an economy which was undergoing what is called a cyclical slowdown. Now, on top of this cyclical slowdown, Modi has a very healthy disrespect for experts. Why do I say healthy? Because I think experts sometimes go well beyond their brief and think that they've got to give to humankind, right? So he has a very healthy disrespect for experts. But to say that experts know nothing is equally stupid. So then he decides to implement perhaps his biggest idea ever, which was demonetization. Just to give you a historical context to this, there is a Tughlaq king. I forget the period. I think it's the 14th century, 13th or 14th century in India, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who's remembered to this day for the fact that he carried out demonetization that failed. By the look of it, Mr. Modi is going the same way. Now the problem with demonetization was that it disproportionately affected the informal sector. The informal sector in India accounts for almost 50% of output and anywhere between 85 to 95% of employment. Now, the standard way in which you figure out how big the economy is, that you have some idea, which is very imprecise. So, which is why whenever economists give you very precise numbers, know that they are talking through somewhere else. So what you do is you have some idea what the formal sector is. You assume the fact that the formal and the informal sector are joined together, and you then add some multiplicative factor to that, and say this is your output. Now it hinges on the fact that the informal and the formal sector grow together. Mr. Modi, in his wisdom, through demonetization, has broken that assumption. As a result of which, the effects of demonetization are visited on the rural economy through demonetization, but do not immediately translate onto official numbers. But as demand slows down, as the rural sector slows down, you get what I have already described for you. So Mr. Subramaniam and Mr. Feldman say that there's a balance sheet crisis because the economy is suffering due to leverage. And I agree with that. But one thing that Mr. Subramaniam and Mr. Feldman do not talk about which is the impact of demonetization on supply capacities of the economy, where demonetization leads to a shrinking of supply capacities of the informal sector and therefore limits the possibility of that sector growing immediately. And any shrinking of capacities takes time to come back. So let me close this. Let me close this by saying that this is a historically unprecedented crisis. This is not cyclical. India has not seen a slowdown in investment saving of this scale ever. And what was a cyclical slowdown was converted into a structural slowdown where supply capacities were damaged by Mr. Modi deciding that you shouldn't listen to economists at all. But before I finish, let me also say that the resistance to Mr. Modi and why the anti-CAA is so important is the fact that today rural India has voted consistently against Mr. Modi. In provincial election after provincial election, rural India is voting against Mr. Modi. But urban India stands in thrall. Urban India still supports Mr. Modi. So the anti-CAA movement is the first crack in that urban coalition and might yet teach Mr. Modi a lesson that he didn't want to learn. Thank you.